Yeah, so I think I'll get started. Um, so I'm Jane. I spent just over a year from July 2021 to August 2022 working at Citrix as an intern, and I mostly contributed to Xen. So in this talk, I'll be sharing a few of the highlights from that year, some of the challenges I encountered, the work that I did, and some of the resources that I found useful during that time, and how I think this could help new contributors. So my development for Xen throughout the year consisted of bug fixes, adding support for new hardware features, or extending existing functionality. So it consisted of first patching. So for changes to the hypervisor, I'd make the changes in my local machine. I'd build and compile the Xen binary, send it to my dev box, and reboot DOM0 and try to observe the changes there, and that consisted of my testing. For changes to Xen tools, similarly, I'd make the changes, build the libraries, binaries, send them to my dev box, and link them appropriately. Sometimes this got a bit confusing because you might have mismatched linking, so I tried to do that in my user directory, so I didn't mess up anything in the dev box. And then for changes to PVHVM drivers, I'd build a modified kernel. I used Alpine Linux because it's lightweight and it was really useful to me. I've also linked a guide that I used, a tutorial on how to set that up. And yeah, so I'd reboot DOM0 with a modified kernel and observe the changes. I was also pointed to GitLab CI/CD by Roger, especially when one of my patches that was for x86 broke an ARM. And so from that experience, I started using it every time I was making a new patch. And then, yeah, I had the typical upstream review process, which I'll be talking more about later on in the presentation. So there were many helpful resources. Before writing any code, I tried to get a background on the topic, and I tried to get in an understanding of the surrounding code, any callers of the code that I was modifying, and the history of the code. So two commands I really used were git blame and git grep. For testing, I tried playing around with GDB, but I found that debug print statements were really the most useful to me and most quick. I used this Bible definitive guide to the Xen hypervisor, which is really useful in understanding features in Xen, and also just knowing the meaning of acronyms that get thrown around. I use the Xen Wiki, the beginner's guide, although it's a bit outdated. For the beginner's guide page, it's actually quite good in also guiding you on the mechanics of sending out a patch. So I found that useful. Obviously, I use programmers' manuals for any hardware features. Obviously, I didn't read through all of them, but I read the appropriate chapters for what I was working on. Recordings from previous Xen summits were very useful, and they're available on YouTube, and some of the older ones on Vimeo. And people, most importantly. So I was mentored by Andrew Cooper and Roger Balmone, but also many other people from the company. I asked for help, and also people from outside the company, and also any feedback from any of you when I was sending out a patch really helped me improve, and I tried to use that feedback for future submissions to try and not make the same mistakes. So work done. I'll speak briefly about it. I guess the key here is just showing how the complexity of what I worked on was built on as the year progressed. And I had the opportunity to work on many kind of random things that helped me interact with different parts of the hypervisor, and that really benefited my learning process. So one of the first things I worked on was correcting the output from Excel Create to Serial Console, because config PV32, when it was disabled and when you try to boot a PV32 guest, it would give a not incorrect, but a very unhelpful message. So that was one of the first things I worked on. Test resources, which is part of the test interface in Xen that is still growing. But to check that physical memory mapping when we were trying to map 40 pages from a guest was done correctly, because that wasn't being checked. Exposing the null selector clear space AMD CPU ID bit in Xen that I think had existed for a while, but that work hadn't been done. Adding support for the invalidate page broadcast instruction to allow APIC virtualization to be done on a per domain basis. No, on a per host basis, instead of just a per host basis, yes. Adding support in Linux for the hypercore, so this was when I worked a little bit on PV-HVM drivers. And incomplete, so there are many things that didn't have enough time to finish before my placement ended. But I think one of the most interesting for me was trying to fix a bug with live patching. Andrew told me a hack had been made for a Citrix customer at the time, but nothing was actually properly upstream for Xen. And this was for live patching inventory code. So I even have the patches in my GitHub personal fork. And yeah, I found that quite interesting because I had to set up my own live patch, and it had many steps. And I think one of the parts of that work was actually committed, but it was a very small thing. So working on Xen was challenging. Sometimes it was hard to figure out what work had to be done. When I started, myself and another intern, we were given a list of tasks by Andrew. But it didn't feel that there was a centralized platform for any Xen contributor to know of work they should be doing. I even found that there was a newbie that emailed the mailing list to ask, oh, what work should I do? So I think having a platform, and I was very glad to know that GitLab was being used for issue tracking, and I think that can really help a new contributor engage more with Xen. So yeah, GitLab. And actually, if you're very interested in that, you should be in the other presentation. And then some of my patches had long review times, and I think that could have been mitigated by me being more diligent and timely with responding to maintainers' comments. On the other hand, I think a new contributor shouldn't rush to send out a new version before obtaining feedback from all the CC'd maintainers. Because you send out a new version to address a certain comment, and then you come in, and then you send out another, and it just gets very tiring for maintainers. So I guess giving some time for all the maintainers to respond, but at the same time not hesitating to ping maintainers if your patch is just sitting in the mailing list for a long time. One challenge that I had that diminished throughout my time working on Xen was style conformance. Style deviations become more obvious as you interact more with the code, but in the beginning, you really might not see them. So I think solution here is to check for surrounding code and try to match your code to surrounding code. Use the style documentation, but a style checker could also help a lot. When I was making the patch for the PVHVM driver, using the check patch Perl script in Linux helped me. Something similar in Xen could be useful. Also, you can configure Clang format for Xen, but I guess if there are many, but I guess the style checker could help, and I think there's going to be discussion about that later on today in the design sessions. And overall, just learning Xen takes time. So when I started, one of my biggest difficulties was really understanding the architecture of Xen, that the hypervisor and the tools are separate. And once I began to understand that better, writing code became much easier. Not easy, but easier. So yeah, I guess if you notice that learning is taking time, you're probably on the right path. And yeah, some of the things you might struggle with in the beginning, for me, by the end of the placement, became automatic. So yeah, it's a bit of a short presentation, but thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them if I can.